Good afternoon and welcome to Drapers Connects. My name is Jill Gagan and I'm the editor of Drapers. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Drapers Connects is our series of Q&A discussions, panel talks and webinars that aim to bring the fashion retail industry together to discuss the biggest issues of the day. As well as our live webinar series, you can access an archive of all of our past webinar recordings at drapersonline.com. Today, in partnership with NuOrder by Lightspeed, we'll be discussing how women in retail lead the change. Thank you very much to our panel for joining us. Could you please introduce yourselves? Beth, let's start with you.
Hi everybody, I'm Beth Pettit. I am the head of menswear and children's wear at John Lewis, and I've been in the fashion industry for over 20 years. I love being part of the fashion industry, but I also love my life outside of fashion as well. I love reading, traveling, drinking great wine, all sorts of stuff like that. So really looking forward to our discussion today.
Lovely, Beth. Thank you. Ida, over to you.
Hi everyone, it's lovely to be here, and I've had the pleasure to get to know these women a little bit beforehand, so I know you're in for a wild but fun ride. My background is 24 years on the corporate ladder. I was in buying, I worked at Harvey Nichols, Net-a-Porter, and then Browns, where I was the buying director until December 23. And then I left to set up an agency with my dear friend Ramya. I now have two companies, creative branding companies that works with everything from brands to retailers. I do a bit of board work, which has been very rewarding because I could finally do that. And I also work with trade shows like Pitti Uomo. I also work with London Fashion Week and Amsterdam Fashion Week. But my real passion, the thing I burn for and I wish I could do full time, is mentoring new talent. So I work across a few different initiatives on that. And I'm very proud to be a global ambassador for Graduate Fashion Week for all the young people that haven't graduated yet.
Brilliant, Ida. Thank you very much. And Danielle, please introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about NuOrder by Lightspeed.
Thank you. It's great to be here. My name is Danielle Fairfield, and I'm the head of retail by NuOrder by Lightspeed. NuOrder is an ecosystem that is backed by Lightspeed Commerce, which is a billion-dollar company. We offer a number of solutions that enable brands and retailers to connect, collaborate, and make smarter wholesaling decisions together. I've been with NuOrder for a little more than 5 years, but I've been in the fashion industry too for more than 20 years. My team is responsible at NuOrder for working across all of our multi-brand retailers, and I absolutely love it. Before working in NuOrder, I worked in retail in buying, planning, strategy, and ops. For most of my tenure was at Saks Fifth Avenue, but I also worked in Europe at Galeria Kaufhof, the Bay Netherlands, and I actually started my career at Lord & Taylor. I too also love my life outside of work. I'm a very proud mother of a recent 2-year-old.
Brilliant. That's great, Danielle. Thank you very much. To our audience, if you're watching live, please feel free to ask questions via Zoom's Q&A function, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those throughout the discussion this afternoon. So let's get started. Despite the fashion industry's move towards inclusivity, there are still many cultural and structural barriers that women face in fashion retail. What are they, and what can we do to start breaking these barriers down? Danielle, why don't you kick us off?
I can start. So something that I was actually reflecting on is, in my time in NuOrder, my role has become very global. And I have had the luxury in my retail career of working with some incredible women leaders. They were chief merchants, head of buying across, my the different companies I worked at in the US. And as I became more global, I learned that it doesn't always translate across the globe in the different cultures. So in the US, I've seen like quite a few, women leaders, but then in the UK, there are also leaders like Beth and Ida, but it doesn't always translate across Europe. So for example, last year, I had the opportunity to attend a CEO summit in Berlin, and I was one of the very few women there. And I found it very interesting because in the US, we always look to Europe for fashion as fashion leaders. But then I found it interesting, like, I've seen more female leaders, in my experience in the US than I have across Europe. So the culture does play large role. And so that's just something that I was really reflecting on. And I think some of the barriers can be that I've found are sometimes really strict office policies where as a woman, flexibility really helps be our best selves and really thrive. And also creating strong allies, volunteering for different projects, expanding your knowledge so you can evolve with the ever-changing retail industry, and ultimately differentiating yourself, I think really helps break these barriers down to set you up for success.
Absolutely. Beth, what do you think?
I fully agree with Danielle. I think it's really interesting to reflect on sort of how different cultures play into this. I guess, I would acknowledge my experience as a white privileged woman as well and say that. But, my particular sort of comment on it is there are some really obvious things like childbirth is an interesting one. Not everybody goes through it. So that can be divisive sometimes. But I do think we've made a big march towards, better equality and policy making, on that subject. And certainly at John Lewis, we now have a 6-month leave for everybody, man or woman. If they choose the route of parenthood, then they've got that available to them fully paid. But the other interesting one is getting older in the workplace and menopause. That is something that definitely all women will go through. So I think that could be potentially quite unifying as something that we're all going to experience. But it is a kind of inevitable fact, I guess, of being a woman, and people are, choosing or economically having to work later on into their careers than they previously might have done. So I think, going through big changes as a woman in the workplace is something that we definitely face. And I think in terms of, what should we be doing to break it down? I mean, being a visible role model and role modeling how your experience of that and how it feels and how you want other people to have permission to feel is really, really key, I think. So, we've talked about, Danielle mentioned flexi working, which I think is really interesting. How we flexi work is just as important as the fact that we do flexi work. So I think there was a time post-pandemic where flexi working meant you just do everything all at the same time and you multitask and you must be great at it because you're a woman. Actually, the way that I've seen it evolve and that, we're trying to role model it in the workplace is be really focused and present in work, but be really focused and present outside of work and be proud of that absence. And, in that absent time, whatever you're choosing to do in your domestic sphere, kids or no, furry friends, whatever that looks like, you should be celebrated for that. That's absolutely a great thing. So, I think take an interest in what people do in their free time, celebrate it with them, and give them permission to, I guess, bring that side of them into work as well. And then, it means that people have the energy to focus and be present when they are in work. So I think there's a lot of role modeling we can do to lead on that.
Absolutely. It's that balance, isn't it? Brilliant. And Ida, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think both Danielle and Beth has really hit the nail on the head. And obviously, Danielle, I know you work with a lot of brands and seen a lot of retailers. And, I saw a lot of NuOrder in my time in buying as well. So I think I know all the all the organizations you're talking about as well. And I couldn't agree more. I think my experience is in the luxury part of the industry. And there is definitely still a glass ceiling. So even though you have maybe like the chief merchants and so on, that CEO level, to Danielle's point, it is still very male, white oriented. And I think, I mean, a lot of that is a legacy, I think, unfortunately, as well. It's the sort of like, don't break it, the pattern, don't change the mold. We've done this, we've always done it this way. I've seen this with the board work that I'm doing. And I think what is really exciting there is that a lot of people are now, there's a lot more women joining boards and there are more female CEOs, for sure, but not enough by far. And I think in terms of how you can break that is obviously to be a leader yourself. And, both Danielle and Beth touch on this, but, be a leader who nurtures and lead by values. And I think many times maybe on your way up, there is this, at least in the fashion industry, unfortunately, not so much anymore, but still like this legacy of being ruthless and leading an iron fist. And I think is actually leading with empathy and compassion. So basically maybe not always how you were treated on your way, but actually how you want to be treated. Have open conversations. I think this is super important. The demand transparency. I think this is so important. The salary, because this is also on the way up. The salary gap. There's so much written about it. UK obviously is constant kind of debate that goes on and on and on, but also the leadership structure. How is it all formed? Like the more transparent it is, the more the conversation can be going. And I think this also goes for seeking mentors outside your organization, like contact women that you look up to, learn from them. I think one of the many, many wonderful things with the virtual world is that you can connect with people from all across the globe. So the world is so much bigger than it used to be, or when it was when I started. So network with those people. Together we were much stronger. And having someone sometimes just a shoulder to cry on is also important, and to share your experience with, and kind of get some tips on how to deal with that. Because although you can get a lot from and you should get a lot from your own organizations, sometimes also having that kind of inside, like outside perspective, I think is really, really key. And I think, I always prefer when I can to meet people in person, because it's, that energy is there. But, the reality is that virtually, digitally, whichever way you connect, there is so much more that we can do together. So yeah, that would be my few tips.
Absolutely, Ida, and we will definitely talk into a lot of those points throughout our discussion today. So, you mentioned hierarchy there. So, I'd like to touch on that first of all. So, you've all risen to top leadership roles within the industry through a mix of traditional and non-traditional routes. So how are you kind of seeing those paths to the top and those hierarchies changing, particularly for fashion retail? Are we seeing more female CEOs? There is still a glass ceiling there, but how are we seeing that shift happen?
Yeah, I can jump in here just to continue my thoughts, but obviously as I touched on it, and I remember, like, when I started my career, I never thought, and I remember distinctly people asking me, do you want to be a buying director? And I was like, no, I can't be that iron fist lady, because that was very much the kind of this really structural phase of working where, sometimes people didn't even talk to people on a lower level, or there was like even hierarchies within, like the actual departments, which I think thankfully has all almost disappeared now. And I think when I look at the buying world today, for example, it's a completely dramatic change. There are incredible role models. Just to name a few, that are all mothers as well, that show that you can, in a one way, have it all, I guess. So people like, Lydia at Liberty, she's a mother of three. She's got a really young daughter. Astrid at the Webster. She's also an incredible, she's got two very young kids, but she's the fashion and buying director. Tiffany Sue, My Teresa, which is like probably the biggest company in the world now. She had a little baby, super cute, but there's still like absolutely fearful woman like Alison Lonis, she's got kids. There's so many examples now that you could look to and be inspired by. Natalie Massenet, I worked for her, so I've seen myself what an inspirational leader she is and was today as well. So yeah, I think there's so much positive things coming out, and so many examples that you can look up to. Thanks.
Absolutely. Brilliant. And Beth, what do you think? Are you seeing those hierarchies change, kind
Yeah.
of throughout your career?
Yeah, I think, and I probably had a more traditional route, if you like, kind of progressing through the ranks of what buying means. But the thing that I have seen, and we have a patronage of the British Fashion Council at John Lewis, which I take a really sort of passionate interest, is actually, if you look at CEOs purely in the top 50 companies, it's still only about 14% of females who occupy C-suite roles. But in terms of people starting their own businesses, the female founder rate is incredible. And I find that really interesting. I would say I'm seeing more brands led by females who have a real value system that they're bringing to what they do than I ever have before over the last few years. And I think in part that is born out of women wanting to create their own constructs and their own idea of what success is and their own ways of working. So I find that a really exciting shift. And I definitely think that, we've got a role to play in terms of nurturing that. I think the other thing I've seen is that there is more open-endedness to embracing people from other skill sets in fashion. So, you know, we cannot be arrogant about fashion and what it is. It changes all the time. And actually, there are people from, you know, from government, from other commercial environments, just, you know, a diverse sort of population of people who have something to bring to the industry. And I definitely have started to see a more open-mindedness to embracing those skill sets, and I think that's to be welcomed.
Absolutely.
I would actually add to that, and that actually is a good transition into my career, because I have not had the traditional career by any means, and it's embracing those different types of roles and really differentiating yourself to kind of break out of the mold. So retail is constantly changing, as we always know. And so solving different types of problems, making yourself vulnerable and learning different pieces of the business can really, you know, crack that, and you can become much more successful. Like in my experience, I was in a pretty traditional path, but wasn't honestly felt stuck and wasn't really getting to where I wanted to go and be. And so I had the opportunity to take on a very different project for a few retailers that my parent company owned in Europe, which is what led me to Galeria Kaufhof and the Bay, Netherlands. And in that position, I solved very different problems than I would have done in planning at Saks. And I got to meet very different people, learn different cultures, solve different problems. And that role and that choice of going to Europe is really set me on the path to where I am today. And I wouldn't be here if and I know that if I had kind of stuck with the same role. And it was really differentiating myself and stepping out that allowed me to really become where I am today. And honestly, I think it's the greatest thing I ever did, because I absolutely love my job.
Absolutely. So taking that risk to do something different and to kind of
Yeah.
broaden your skill set.
Absolutely. Because especially in today's world, retail is very complex and constantly changing. And so that's why we have all these different roles, as Ida and Beth were saying, like bringing in all the different pieces across government and tech. And so putting yourself in these positions and learning different skills and working with different types of people is really going to help broaden your horizon. And you can then rise to different levels and still have a seat at the table. It might be a different seat than what you were initially expecting, but you're still there and you could still make a difference and add value and lead incredible teams. And it's just doing it a little bit differently.
Absolutely. And Beth, I wanted to ask you about your kind of your career within John Lewis. So you've worked in menswear for a long time and in roles kind of buying menswear brands for John Lewis. So what has being a woman in an often male-dominated sector taught you? And do you have any advice for women who are maybe operating in very male-dominated spaces?
Yeah, it's such a brilliant question. And I think there are two sides to it, because I mean, I've done a number of different roles at John Lewis and outside actually. And, you know, I think there's a very nurturing female environment within retail and within fashion. And I loved what Ida said, you know, about kind of, you know, reaching out and finding a shoulder to cry on and kind of joining with other people, you know, as your kind of allies. And I think that is definitely some advice that I would give, and probably should have done sooner. But I think, you know, my approach to, I think, working in that type of environment when it comes to the industry, the sort of menswear industry, which can be very male dominated, is I absolutely had to project confidence. And it's that age old, I had to lean in, you know, and it's quite a matey, blokey environment at times, you know, in the men's brands world. Anyone who's interacted with it will know what I mean. It's a great place. It's really fun, but it absolutely has that essence to it. And I realised quite quickly that I wasn't going to be able to compete on that. You know, I'm not a bloke, I'm not a man. I wasn't going to kind of change who I was. So I kind of went, you know, and operated completely from my professional sphere. You know, I went straight to the highest contacts I could find in the brands world, and I built a professional relationship with those people. You know, I was in control of the buying budgets, money talks, and that's how I made it work for me. Once I was able to start delivering good results and got more comfortable with it, then I kind of dialed down and maybe established more of those, you know, personal relationships. But it was important for me to be able to show that I could do the job on my own terms, and probably to call on that professional context. It worked for me. I think things have changed a little bit now, and I think, you know, we are seeing sort of different ways of working. But I would definitely say, you know, don't compete and try to be the person that you're not, and you know, root yourself in where you're where you know you're strong and comfortable, and tackle things from that, you know, vantage point. I think as you get more comfortable, you can flex the fact that your difference can be your superpower, you know, and then you can ask the questions that nobody else asks. And that can come from quite an innocent perspective. But I think certainly it helps to kind of build yourself some confidence blocks to start with, and you know, kind of, you know, get results going, and be really good at what you do to be able to tackle that.
Absolutely. And we've mentioned a few times about mentorship and finding allies within, you know, kind of your sections of the business, or, you know, within the industry more generally. So is there any kind of practical advice for our listeners on that side of things? You know, how do you go about kind of becoming a mentor, or finding a mentor, or, you know, kind of finding allies within your own business or other businesses? You know, kind of any tips that you can give, you know, open it up to the whole panel,
Yeah.
just to build those networks that we've spoken about.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what Ida and Danielle have to say on it. I think one thing I would say, being part of a huge business, is it's actually very interesting to explore a sort of reverse mentoring. And you don't even need to set that up officially. You know, with a lot of my one-to-one time with my teams or kind of social events, I will ask, you know, I'd be really interested in what's going on for them. What are the barriers that are getting in their way? What can I do more of? And just, you know, how, and sometimes, you know, what can the leadership do better? You know, separate yourself out from it if it makes them more comfortable to answer that question, but be curious, I think, and just kind of, you know, for us, I think really try to understand what they're going through, and, you know, what sort of issues they're facing. And you can do that by learning from the people who kind of, you know, work for you and are coming up, sometimes more so than those that, you know, have been doing this for a while.
Brilliant.
Uh,
Ida, yeah.
Yeah, no, you know, because it's something that I always, you know, kind of lent on as well myself when I had a big team, was that you learn as much from the top as you do from the bottom. And I think, you know, the reality is, particularly in these times when, you know, sometimes you can get just like, you know, just the tech advancement that, you know, Danielle worked about is like, you know, the reality is, you know, those guys that just started out, they've literally grown up in a digital age, which I definitely didn't. And that sort of just sometimes blows my mind, you know, what I've learned from that. But also, just like Beth talked about, like the structural part. I think for me, what you know, something that's in a way it's actually very quite easy is just that kind of, not easy to say, but it's the networking part of it. So really could kind of like have this like view on like panel talks that are happening, you know, like go and attend. I mean, like I helped the British Fashion Council run that pop-up and sort of create the pop-up shop they did. And we ran like a bunch of panel talks there. And it was incredible to see how many like students, people that wanted to get into fashion, that came and they engaged and asked questions. And what I can tell you from that was so many of them like actually walked away with like internships or connections, and, you know, any of those things. I know there's a lot of these kind of like communities that are being created today as well. And I think actually you at Drapers got one. And I think all of these things where you can just be with like-minded people, like, you know, that are engaged with something, or there's like a you know, I guess like a subject that you're passionate about, be it sustainability or just fashion in general, you know, be there. You know, I think particularly when you can be there in person, I think that's where I've seen really good connections, and that's where I ended up with people, you know, that I ended up then going for a coffee with, and you know, that because they've asked my help or advice on something, and you just, it's really lovely, in a very selfish way sometimes to actually have that interaction. And I cannot recommend it enough. I think when you have knowledge, there is a responsibility, and we should all sort of lean on that a bit more. And I appreciate we all have to, earn the money and pay bills and so on. But giving back, anything that anyone who's been around for a while has that knowledge can help someone else on their career, not make those mistakes, or like turn their businesses in the right direction. And I think that responsibility, particularly in these volatile times, is essential. So, I think also like to be more open in general, not just towards like you finding people, but also to Beth's point, to give back yourself, whether that is in, a structured way in the organization, or just, people that you meet out and about, strike up that conversation, like even like if you're in a bar, like, hey, talk to someone. I mean, sometimes when I ended up with connections, it's been because we started talking about a handbag or a pair of shoes or something, right? So it's the unexpected as well that sometimes leads to the most magical friendships and connections for the future. So I think, I guess, like, be brave. Like, what was sometimes you feel that it's like this barrier and you can't do it and you get nervous. And I think that's like something for sure that I'm still working on that myself, to be honest, especially if it's someone I really look up to. But just, what's the worst thing that can happen? In reality, it's not going to be that bad. So, just be brave and try new
Brave.
things.
Yeah. Be confident, put yourself out there. Absolutely.
I just like to add, I couldn't agree more with both of you, especially about being brave. And if you are, working across a number of different projects also at your company, you can create extremely meaningful relationships that will last a very long time. And so just put yourself out there, create a bridge, and over time, relationships will develop. And you never know when you might be working with them again. You never know when they could become a mentor or you're their mentor. Like, there's a number of ways that things can change. And one thing that's great about our industry is it's actually quite small. And so you always will come back in touch with someone, you never know. So I couldn't agree more with both of them, both Beth and Ida.
Absolutely. And everyone tends to stay in fashion retail. They'll move to different jobs, but they do tend to stay within the industry. So yeah, you never know who you'll meet again in a future role. Um, so things are changing. There is a shift happening, but so much of fashion retail is built on legacy, and with that maybe comes a resistance to adopting new approaches and changes within businesses. So Danielle, it'd be great to get your thoughts on how women can really play a role in making those changes.
So we actually encounter this, a little bit with NuOrder as we're, launching transformational technology. And there can be naysayers, there can be those who push back. And my advice is honestly just being empathetic and listening and learning, because quite often folks have been doing what they've been doing for a very long time. They've seen things come and go. They are great at what they do and they don't need a change. And sometimes it's just listening to where they're coming from, learning more about them, learning more, and creating, honestly, some just trustworthy and authentic relationships, and then showing them how this new approach can help them. This actually happened with someone on my team 2 weeks ago with one of our retailers, where there was a very senior buyer who was just like, I don't need NuOrder. I've been doing this a long time. And I actually suggested that a member of my team just take her out for coffee and listen and hear where she's coming from. And she did. And she learned a little bit more about her process and just showed her, actually, here's how we can make your life a little bit easier, because who doesn't want that? And it's just listening and creating that relationship. And sometimes people just want to be heard. And I think that's a initial very strong step into pushing people forward.
Mhm. Absolutely. And Ida, what would your advice be, for leaders to tap into change and innovation and to kind of advocate for change within their businesses?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that change is inevitable, right? Like, we're constantly changing. So I always find it really intriguing when people are scared of change, because actually it should be exciting. So I think is that, embracing it, but also trying to be one step ahead. So, continuously review what you're doing. And you know, to Danielle saying, it's like so easy to get stuck in this, like, okay, we've always done it this way, it works this way. But that's why I always found it most exciting, is like finding a way to do something better. You know, just because you've done something one way doesn't mean it isn't the better way of doing it. And that's where, in my career at least, I found it really interesting to just spend a lot of time in all the different kind of, like, you know, levels that we had as well. And also, to Danielle's point, with people that didn't work in the buying team. You know, I actually think, you know, you learn as much from the other departments, that interaction, like when all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait, we can do this so much better. You know, like the interaction between, you know, buying and merchandising, but also like if you have a physical store, if you don't have a physical store, you know, the sales team, the retail team. I mean, I've learned so much by just spending time on the shop floor and just hearing their, you know, excitements, but also frustrations. I'm like, wait, what can we do about this? And why doesn't this work? And, you know, spending time with the logistical team, understanding, you know, why is this not coming the way that we do? And then, you know, really kind of advocating for trying to make changes when you see that opportunity, or finding new solutions and being out there and, you know, going to seminars. Like, I think that's also really important. Like, you know, whether that is like, you know, the Global Fashion Summit for like sustainability, whether it's just, you know, leadership things that comes together for your industry or outside industry. I mean, I think what's happening in AI at the moment is super interesting. So for me, it's like, you know, staying, you know, on top of that. I mean, I'm not sure if I can stay on ahead of AI, but at least kind of being at the forefront and understanding, and, you know, what can be used for that, to not as to our detriment, but actually to our advantage, and how can that be made exciting? I think that kind of the curiosity and the listening, like, you know, all across, and hearing other people's way of doing things, you know, that interchange and interaction is really important. That would probably be my 2 cents.
Brilliant, Ida. And Beth, what are your thoughts on women leading the change within legacy businesses?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think the you know, showing that you're open-minded and interested in what's happening around you, and you know, making sure that people see that is so critical. You know, and I'm somebody who has been, you know, I've had a lengthy career, you know, with one brand, but I think, you know, what I try to do, you know, in that is make sure that, you know, I'm really lucky. You know, my networks, even just in one large business, are vast. You know, I've got all my customers. You know, if I want to know what's going on and how people are feeling, I can spend a day in store. You know, we have to do that anyway as part of our, you know, kind of our peak time support as a cooperative business. We go and spend time in stores and we work on the shop floor. You know, and that is brilliant for just kind of plugging into, you know, what's happening. Also, you know, I've got loads of brands that I work with now. You know, you just need to go and spend time with sort of any of those guys and learn what's happening for them and their consumer, and already you're sort of propelled into a different space. So I think I love what Ida says about, I think, stretching outside of your sphere, and, you know, to go to that webinar or that seminar or something that you're interested in. But don't forget that actually lots of this is at your fingertips. And if you're time stretched, like many of us are, you know, plug into what's around you and show that curiosity that you've all talked about. And I think that, you know, that will really help you challenge some of that legacy, but also show that you're open to challenging it.
Absolutely. And linked with kind of leading change within the businesses and within the industry, another challenge faced by women in fashion retail, as well as every other industry, is inappropriate behavior in the workplace. So, as we've seen in the news this week. So, how do we as female leaders kind of deal with this within businesses, and how can we help put a stop to it?
I don't mind sort of, you know, carrying on. I think, I mean, it's just a zero tolerance approach, and it's easier said than done, I think. But it's, you know, I think it's becoming more and more possible that, you know, if you are joining up with the people around you who are like-minded, who want to turn up to work and do a great job and have fun while they're doing it, and you're closing ranks, is going to make it really hard for that behavior to kind of, you know, bubble up in the first place. So I think having a strong sense of community and fostering that around the people that you work with, and that positivity, is kind of step one just for preventing it. And I think the other thing is that we, you know, we call it out if we see it, and we we role model it? There's quite often opportunities to join, lots of networks, and often in big corporates, they'll have networks. We have a gender equality network. Actually, our MD sponsors that. We have a working parent network. There are places where you can draw strength, I think, from people's feeling in this place, and come alongside them and align yourselves with those movements. And I think it does require you to positively do that, so that apathy doesn't take over and this sort of behavior bubbles up. But I think it's a big thorny subject, and it's not easily tackled overnight. But I think, just being strong and creating strong senses of communities and belonging and value systems do help make that behavior less possible.
Absolutely. It is that about that culture shift, isn't it?
I completely agree. And also including having a culture where people feel very safe to raise any concerns, and there no fear of retaliation, and they just feel very comfortable in a safe environment is critical, in addition to what Beth was saying. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both Danielle and Beth, and I think the reality is that obviously it does still exist in our industry, as we've seen this week only. I think that is incredibly frustrating, but being there and allowing people to also talk about things like that, even if it's not in your own organization. I think, when there is something that is so like hard hitting, regardless of what it is, there's been numerous, I think even, since the last 5 years, like that the amount of, very poignant and heartbreaking subjects that come to a thing. I think making sure that there is communication around that and forums. I mean, Beth spoke about these like different groups as well, but I think also just having open forums for people to actually, like share what they feel about this. And then also kind of actually, to what we talked about earlier, also allow everyone to come to the table also with how they think. How can we as an organization also do this? Again, going that kind of, every level of the organization. But definitely for the leadership to pull these things together and allow these conversations to happen so they don't happen in silos. Because I think that's sometimes also one of the issues, that there is strong voices, but like we're not, together, so they're not heard properly.
Absolutely. And we at Drapers are running an anonymous survey at the moment to kind of map the scale of the issue within the industry today. So if anybody watching would like to tell us their opinion or their experiences, again, completely anonymous and off the record, please do fill that in online. I do think it's so important that we all kind of come together to shine a light on what's happening and to drive that change. So today we want to talk about leadership and leading as a woman within businesses. So Ida, you did mention some of the very prominent female leaders that you've worked with over the years. So Natalie Massenet from Net-a-Porter, Holly Rogers from Browns as well. So are there any lessons that these leaders kind of have taught you over the years, or that you have kind of advice that you've picked up that you'd like to share with our listeners today?
So many. I mean, I feel actually incredibly blessed in my career. I mean, also, I should hasten to add as well that I probably like hunted Holly Rogers down to hire me because I was so inspired by seeing her in action, and her kindness. And I think this is obviously, I mean, some of the audience may not be familiar with this, but like actually one of the first things that Holly did when she started at Browns was launch this campaign that was like cool to be kind, and that was very much like a Holly Rogers motto. And I'm privileged enough to have her as my continued mentor, and she's actually one of my closest friends today. For me, it's like one of the many. I mean, I feel like this. Like I could sit there for like a day and talk about all the things I learned from both her and Natalie, who I obviously, when I started, also had the pleasure of working with. And I think, I think she was, one of those people that, she's created such impact in the industry that like her voice is still heard, or even though she obviously now sits on a very different side of the business. But what they open up, both of them, by being so prominent and really kind of advocating that change and, being brave and doing something that hadn't been done before. Now we think it's like, oh yeah, online, companies. But like, I mean, the reality is like the only reason why the online companies exist is because everyone else was stuck in that kind of legacy way, or like, oh no, the internet, I should not mention any names, but I remember there was a very prominent CEO at the time that said that internet was a fad. So, I think that we definitely proved that man wrong. But I think both of them really led with compassion. And just like they were not afraid, I think, particularly Natalie, not afraid to show feelings. I mean, I remember when we had the 10-year anniversary and she was like crying on stage about, the people that had been with her. And it was such a powerful movement. But also giving the sense of anything is possible, regardless of gender. Because I think that's also important, like it's not all about women. There's so many amazing, people out there, and everyone has to be seen and heard. And I think they both created environments that very much felt that. I think, for Holly, she really had this like sense of like, it's not just about like what she wants, it's about understanding also how we get to know each other. And maybe it's because I'm a daughter of a psychoanalyst, but like for me, psychology, it's so, understanding, the personalities, reading the energy in the room, like things like that. I think she was great in that. And she really encouraged that for us as well, to us to understand our peers, to understand our teams, and for our teams to also then like that trickle down effect. How do we speak better with people that have different opinions, different way of phrasing? And I think that creates a really amazing environment where everyone feels like, okay, this person understands me. So, I think so many lessons. And actually, I've been blessed enough, again, like one of the boards that I sit on, Philippa K, we have a female CEO, and Marie, is creating this environment as well in that organization. So, I think, in that way, I've seen some not so good things, but I've also been very blessed in my career to just be inspired and continue to be inspired.
Brilliant. And building on that, Danielle, could you talk to us a little bit about the concept of empathy-driven management and how you bring that to your team? So, talking about all of that Ida has mentioned there, that compassion, that empathy, that understanding. How do you actually, create that and drive that within your business?
Yes, I really appreciate what Ida was speaking about, understanding the person and really, hearing them out. And that's where I start. I think it's really important to understand what's going on with your team, what's going on in their lives, asking how they're doing, how they're feeling, how are their kids, how are their partners, how are their families. In order for them to be successful and happy at work, they really need to be, it's important that they're successful and happy outside of work. And just to give an example, there was a member of my team a few weeks ago. I could tell she was really distracted, and I was like, what's going on? And the poor soul had her identity stolen, and I could tell she was very, very concerned, and I was like, it's okay. Go focus on what you need to focus on. That's what's critical. Like, that's so important, and the poor soul. And so it's like really allowing yourself to, and allowing your team to feel comfortable and confident sharing what's going on in their lives, so that they can then ultimately at work, focus and be their best selves. So that's really where I tried to lead from.
Absolutely. And Beth, that really builds on what you said earlier about that work-life balance. And how do you have any advice on how to kind of create that for yourself and for your teams, and how that works?
I love what Danielle said there, actually. And I think, I think sometimes when, you're in a busy environment, you can forget to ask those questions. And so, and you might be on the receiving end of it as well. And it's often not that people don't care, but it's an effort to make that time, I think, to ask people a little bit about what's going on with them. So I try to, talk a little bit about what's going on with me, and kind of open up those lines of communication. And, I'm massively passionate about my time off. I love time off. It's brilliant. And I want everyone to have time off and love it too. So I'm always really interested in where people are going on holiday and what they're doing, and getting those tips. Some of my messages with my teams are actually about that, and not just, the business. So I think it's just kind of role modeling it and doing it. And I think there's a point actually that sort of, Danielle mentioned around understanding what's going on for somebody, but also how can that benefit you. And there's a commercial angle to this as well, which is, a recent example. I had a maternity returner who is absolutely brilliant at what she does. But she needed a bit of time to get back up to speed, and she needed a challenge and a role that wasn't all consuming. And so we agreed, we contracted. I put her in a position which wasn't kind of high profile, but would give us some really clear and quick stuff to deliver on. And actually we said, don't worry, but just focus on these one or two things for this particular category. And it was brand acquisition. And that's where she spent her time, and everything else sort of fell out the way. But actually, that was brilliant for me because I kind of just needed somebody to do just that in the role. I didn't need all the other stuff, and I couldn't have, I didn't have the energy to kind of take all that stuff on. It worked brilliantly for both of us, and it's not a final position. She'll recalibrate and she'll want to do more, and then we'll figure that one out. But I think, what does the benefit of having that curiosity breed? Well, it means that you can match where somebody is to what they're really strong at, and you can also help them through the challenges where they're struggling. So I've definitely seen it live myself, and I love some of the things the guys were saying on the call.
Absolutely. There is sometimes a narrative around women at work, and we've talked about being confident and putting yourself out there. So how do you be your authentic self without being perceived as being too aggressive or too soft or too emotional, which are things that we sometimes hear in relation to women in the workplace. So how do you kind of be yourself without falling into any of these kind of cliches, for want of a better word?
I have quite a bit to say on that, actually. I
Brilliant.
have personally encountered this throughout my whole career. I'm quite direct, as some of you might see. And I've encountered this myself. And I think my advice and in my experience, it all goes back to what Beth and Ida were saying about work-life balance and being in the right mindset. I myself work out, and it allows me to just be in the right mindset so that I maybe don't initially react in a certain way, and I can approach some things in a calmer nature. But also I find being preparing, just to be thoughtful, and focusing on the big picture, it can really help how you approach something. And sometimes something as simple as taking a deep breath before you speak can really alter your tone so that you don't appear to be too aggressive. But I also would add, and this is something I've experienced as well, if you're in a culture where you feel like that you are coming across too aggressive, or you find that you have to be aggressive quite often in order to be heard, sometimes it's okay to evaluate if that's the best culture for you, and if you need to change and be somewhere where you're not too aggressive and you don't feel like you need to raise your voice in a certain manner in order to be heard, and you can truly be your authentic self and thrive.
Absolutely. Beth, you're nodding. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I know. I think that's so true, and I think I think careers have seasons as well, don't they? So I was sort of ruminating on how I was at the start of my career, and it's one thing to kind of impart advice now, but actually if you're starting out, or you're just sort of you're feeling some of those feelings that Danielle was articulating, what do you do? And I think I think that's absolutely right. I think evaluating whether this is the right place for you is critical, but also joining up with other people and developing those allies is also really, really helpful, because you can change stuff. I've seen it firsthand. I've seen how people join together and can change a culture and can lead cultural change. So I think that's something not to be underestimated as well.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about work-life balance, families and motherhood can play a key part of this conversation. So I myself have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, so I'm very much in the thick of that kind of juggle at the moment. So just to the panel, kind of how did becoming a mother impact yourself as being a leader at work? And do you have any other advice for maybe some mothers that are listening that are leading businesses or leading teams within businesses? Just any advice for them? Danielle, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think becoming a mother was the single most transformational thing in terms of how I am as a whole, but especially as a leader. It has made me more effective at work because Beth was saying about being present. I cannot be a mommy and also do my work at the same time. It just doesn't work that way with a 2-year-old. And so what I find is while I'm at work, I am much more present. I am very, very focused because come the evening, I switch and I become mommy and I can't necessarily go back. And so it allows me to be very, very focused and present in the moment.
Yeah. And I would say, I'd say two things, and I'm always quite careful on this one because I think, my experience was I probably did become a more relaxed leader at the point that, that I became a mother. I sort of let go of a perfectionism, probably out of necessity, because it just wasn't possible to do everything really, really well. But I do think that, some people choose to have children, some people don't. And I don't think that the things that we're discussing should be exclusively available to mothers. I think there is a wider point around, everybody has a life outside of work and needs outside of work. And I think, it's brilliant if as a parent you can, lead the way on some of that because there's a very tangible thing there for you. But I think it's how do you extend that generosity and that spirit to make sure that everybody feels that they can hold both a career or a life in work and, a happy balance outside of it. That being said, one thing I do feel quite strongly is that I think some of the conversation around being a working parent has been masked by what's happened post-pandemic, which is that we've catapulted into a flexi working environment, but we haven't necessarily tackled some of the debate around the fact that childcare is hugely expensive. In the UK, it's one of the most expensive, sort of household costs that you'll encounter, and that absolutely has an impact. And, unfortunately, just because of where we are on the ladder, it does adversely affect women more so than men quite a lot of the time. And I think, we've got our flexi working in theory, but have we really got sort of equality and understanding and empathy towards what being a parent is? And actually, have we faced into some of those tough issues, or has the fact that we've just kind of moved into a flexi working environment hidden some of the fact that actually it's still really expensive to get childcare? You still need to take time out, you still have those gaps, and what are the onuses on us as a group of leaders to kind of call that out and work with it and tackle it, I think.
Absolutely. And Ida, any advice that you have around leading a team of mothers or leading mothers within your businesses?
Yeah, because I mean, not because it's like a secret or anything. So I don't have any kids. I just have babies, which, obviously is a very different animal, no pun intended. But I mean, just to caveat that, I mean, I obviously have a lot of friends that I talked about earlier as well. Mothers are like what you guys do. I mean, all three of you is just absolutely phenomenal. I don't even know. My mind boggles when I hang out with my friends, and especially when they have like 3, 4 kids. I'm just like, you only have 2 hands, right? I don't know, but I think that flexibility. And Beth, I also love what you said, because I think also have to have that. I think particularly today, looking at some of the statistics are coming through as well. It's like, creating that environment. And I think also for another reason, because what I've seen in my career, and it is actually quite terrifying, is that because the only thing that's come out of it is that flexi hours, which frankly, most of the times is not enough. Cost, I think in the luxury part, like just the actual travel these days that you have to do, something that then means that mother chooses to not continue that career. And the problem is what you see then is all this knowledge and expertise are disappearing. And I think, as we talked about earlier, like a healthy company, a great company for me is the balance of that the raw new talent and energy versus like also the knowledge and experience. And then when you remove one block, your structure gets very vulnerable, or it gets kind of just like, okay, but this person is going to do it because they didn't choose to, they choose to not do it. And I think that's not right either. So I think flexibility around everything. I mean, you guys know this, and I think, but flexibility is also just for the people that don't have kids as well. When you need, I mean, Danielle, you talked about the identity theft, like just that flexibility, knowing that things can change on the drop of a hat, and just always being open to that change, and making that person, whether they are mother because their kids is like, the nursery calls. Like I see this with like my lovely, when I go and train, and all of a sudden, my Pilates teacher is like, hey guys, I'm not gonna come today because, someone's just called from the nursery, and it's like 10 minutes before the lesson. It's like, that's fine, it's just, you got to go and be you and do what you need to do. So I think, finding a way of running your business and taking care of your people where you're not forced to make a choice to go away from something you love and leave that. I think this is where all organizations and all of us have more work to do. But I think even opening up that debate and talking about it and finding that flexibility that goes beyond the hours that you work and how you divide it. And I think, Beth, what you talked about, having someone that's like, hey, you know what, you just focus on this now. I think that's brilliant. I think more of that, the better the world will be, actually. So hopefully, that's what can happen. But just
Great idea.
actually, as a final thought, I actually found like a lot of the mothers on my team, I had to like almost like forcefully march out of the office because they were feeling so badly about things that I had to do, that they were then trying to overcompensate. And I'd see them logging in at like all hours of the night after they put their babies down. So I think also like fostering an environment where like you're like, guys, this is not okay. It's okay that you had to leave earlier. And I think there's a lot, obviously now I'm speaking the UK versus Scandinavia, which is like my home region. I think there's a lot that can be learned from the Scandinavian way. When I look at Denmark, for example, where there's so many like multi-million, billion-pound companies, and they have female CEOs or female creative leaders, and they go home at 4. They take like 4 weeks holiday in the summer, and their businesses are amazing because maybe because of what Beth talked about, that bandwidth, the space to think. I mean, I always find when I go away, I have some of my most brilliant ideas. So I think, allowing that space is probably the best gift that we can give to anyone, regardless if they have kids or not.
Absolutely. So one of our audience members has asked a question related to this. They've said, I hear a lot about setting boundaries within the workplace and, maybe getting that balance right. So how do you do that effectively? Any advice on how to implement that?
I think being in control of your own diary as much as possible is helpful, isn't it? And I think, I think by and large, you have to set quite a series of non-negotiable, ways of working, to be quite honest, because there's always the temptation for things to bleed into other things. So I think you do have to be fairly ruthless about, what you are and are not willing to be able to show up for. That being said, and I am lucky enough to flexi work, so I have one Friday off every fortnight. And I think that's a privilege. And so it's rare, but there might be odd occasions where I will join a work call on that Friday, because the benefit of doing so for half an hour grants me peace of mind, gets a decision made, and makes the whole of the following week much smoother. So I think, it is a two-way process. And if you're given flexibility, you've got to give it in return. But I think there is nothing wrong with setting clear boundaries and a positive way about what you will and won't do. And again, I think aligning yourself with other people who can be sponsoring that and supportive of that will help you, because it's a difficult thing to do. I think when you're, at certain points in your career, it's not easy.
I absolutely agree. And I would just add, by leading by example. So I agree, like owning your own diary, blocking out your calendar, and this is when I'm off limits, guys. And then also respecting that of your team, but especially leading by example so that my team sees, okay, she signs off. It's okay for me to sign off as well.
Absolutely. We've had a few more questions, so we'll get through as many of these as we can. Bethan would like to know, she is ahead of buying herself. She said she's very passionate about upskilling the next female leaders in retail. And she would love to hear your tips or advice on how the industry does that. She said that she ran a workshop yesterday and it was very clear that more dedicated training is needed. So how can we kind of foster the next generation of female CEOs within fashion retail?
Yeah, I mean, I think she sort of started some really good work there. So well done to her for starting to do these workshops. I think the first step is always to identify like where are the gaps, what are we missing? And then, my suggestion would be twofold. So one, that's actually setting down inside the organization to find out like how can we try to fill these gaps? So the HR, like the people team, like what can they help provide? Are there tools that we already have to hand that we can use? Can we, is there any budget towards getting like external people in? I think these days, obviously, that doesn't always happen, sadly. But it's if you don't ask, you don't get. But by really identifying and then pushing for those things, as that female leader already, just kind of going, hey guys, this is a real thing, because I want to make sure that we create future stars and that we don't lose them, and that we always have to recruit externally. So like really creating that sort of like and almost like the perfect plan of like how do you get to the next step. And I think this is something that's super inspiring as well. When you join, I mean, there's maybe no such thing as the perfect plan, to be honest, but just like joining somewhere where they have programs, and this again, this shouldn't just be for women, it should be for all genders, where you feel, like, okay, I come in, there is this real like effort from this organization to really like help me get to the next level. Because the reality is like, fashion, like most industries, is like a pyramid structure, right? So you are going to find those frustrating things, but what you want to do is maintain that talent. So how do you keep them excited? How do you get them engaged? And a lot of that is, internal, but also external experiences. Send them off to a negotiation course, allow them to go on that sponsored trip somewhere to, meet people and engage with things. Send them off, don't take on everything yourself. Like, send them to do the panel, send them to cover something, allow them, exposure. And I think most important, allow them to also make mistakes, because you learn more from mistakes sometimes by trying than just if everything is served to you, or if you're so protected that there's no room for error, because that is also like the mollycoddling can also not be great. So I think, yes, be there, but also like allow them to expose themselves. That I think is really important.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts on that?
I completely agree with everything that she said, and would just highlight having a sponsor is really key, and someone who can really set you up for success. And also delegation. There are a number of projects that I have that I share with ladies on my team, to give them the opportunity to really run with something, present in front of senior leaders, to help them build and grow.
Absolutely. I'm afraid we're out of time. Ladies, I can't believe this, that hour has just flown by. So I really want to thank everybody who's watched. Thank you so much for your questions. And we will be able to send those to our panelists afterwards, because we didn't manage to get through all of them. Thank you so much to our panel, to Beth, to Ida, and to Danielle. Thank you for sharing your experience and your insights this afternoon. And thank you very much to our partner, NuOrder by Lightspeed. And hopefully we'll see you all again very soon.